Members of the Ku Klux Klan delivered a Christmas present to former slave Jack Riddle, 107 years old, and his wife Josie, 86 years old. The couple received a radio as a Christmas gift from the Klan, a gesture that, while seemingly benevolent, carries a disturbing irony considering the organization's racist and violent history against African Americans. The Klan promoted white supremacy and used such symbolic acts to attempt to soften its public image while continuing to perpetuate racism and segregation in the United States. In 1863, light-skinned enslaved children in New Orleans were featured in a series of photographs that garnered considerable attention. Though they appeared white, these children were legally deemed black due to the one-drop rule, which dictated that anyone with any African ancestry, no matter how slight, was classified as a slave. Such photographs were employed to raise awareness, highlighting that these children, with no visible African features, were still considered part of the enslaved community. This strategy helped garner support for the establishment of schools for newly emancipated slaves in New Orleans. Here, I present a demonstration of the bell rack, a device used by a slave owner in Alabama to recapture runaway slaves. The contraption, fastened around the neck, featured a bell at the top of a bar. If an enslaved person attempted escape through foliage or trees, the bell would ring, alerting the owner. The bell rack was also secured around the enslaved person's waist with a belt, restricting movement and making escape even more challenging. In this late 19th century photograph from Brazil, we observe an enslaved woman playing with her master's child. During the slave era, it was commonplace for enslaved women to care for their master's children, performing domestic duties and forming emotional bonds. For many white children, enslaved women were ever-present figures, perceived as caregivers or nannies. However, these children also matured within a society that regarded enslaved people as property, fostering a distorted perception of affection and social hierarchy. In this photo, on the left, we see Jesse L. Birch, a bailiff, and Frank M. Rockwell, the local sheriff, on the right, while an African-American woman sits between them. Jesse appears to be aiming his gun at the woman's head, creating a tableau of intimidation and violence. This type of image was frequently used to showcase the power wielded over African Americans through fear and constant menace. Australian Aboriginals are chained in Wyndham Prison, Western Australia, 1902. Much like enslaved Africans in other parts of the world, Aboriginal people were frequently treated as inferior and dehumanized, forced to endure brutal conditions and chained like animals. In addition to being robbed of their liberty, Aboriginal people were subjected to policies aimed at civilizing them, causing repercussions that continue to impact Indigenous communities today. An African American is being whipped inside a prison in the United States in 1889. Though slavery was officially abolished in 1865, the prison system continued to exploit African Americans through forced labor and corporal punishment, particularly in the southern states. Prisons were infamous for exceptionally harsh conditions, and many formerly enslaved individuals were re-enslaved through forced labor under accusations of petty offenses. A portrait of Rinty, a slave from South Carolina, was taken by Louis Agassiz, a Harvard University professor, in 1850. Agassiz employed pseudo-scientific racial theories, such as polygenism, to rationalize the supposed inferiority of Africans. These theories sought to prove that human races were distinct based on physical attributes and were used to justify slavery. Like Agassiz's racist notions, similar theories concerning Jewish people were used in the 20th century by the Nazis to justify persecution, demonstrating the enduring influence of these fallacious beliefs. In this 1860 photograph, we see Andrew Chandler, a member of the 44th Mississippi Infantry, alongside his former slave, Silas Chandler. During the Civil War, Silas accompanied Andrew as a servant, but at a critical juncture, he saved Andrew's life during the Battle of Shiloh. After the war, as a token of gratitude, Andrew granted Silas a parcel of land where he constructed a church for his community. Silas continued to live and work in the same area where he had been enslaved, but now with newfound respect. Jonathan Walker, known as the man with the branded hand, was an American reformer and abolitionist who became a national hero in 1844. He was tried and convicted for attempting to assist 7 fugitive slaves seeking freedom. Apprehended during the attempt, Walker was penalized with his hand branded with the letters SS, signifying slave stealer, a mark inflicted by the U.S. government. Rather than silencing him, this punishment transformed Walker into a symbol of resistance to slavery and the fight for abolition. In this photograph, taken around 1890 in Zanzibar, we see a young enslaved boy holding a log over his head as a form of punishment. At that time, Zanzibar was a major hub of the slave trade in the Indian Ocean. Enslaved children were often compelled to perform grueling physical labor and were harshly punished for minor infractions. Slavery in Zanzibar was officially abolished in 1897, but the repercussions of this era lingered for a considerable time in the region. A Union soldier poses with his contraband, a young servant who is still a child. Many Union soldiers forged meaningful relationships with contraband families, and some even became active proponents for African American rights after the war, contributing to efforts for emancipation and equality. In 1907, in Oman, a British sailor is photographed removing shackles from the legs of a Swahili slave who had worn them for 3 long years. This moment transpired during a British operation in the Indian Ocean, where the Royal Navy patrolled the area to intercept slave ships and combat human trafficking. These patrols had been active for decades, and their objective was to liberate those held captive. Sarah Breedlove, better known as Madam C.J. Walker, drives her new car in 1911. Sarah was the first woman in the United States to become a self-made millionaire. Born the daughter of formerly enslaved parents, Walker built a beauty product empire. At its peak, her fortune was estimated at approximately $1 million, which today would be equivalent to $30 million. In addition to her entrepreneurial achievements, she leveraged her wealth to support civil rights initiatives and contribute to healing the wounds caused by slavery, promoting education and empowerment within the Black community. Africans are captured aboard a slave ship, many in a state of malnutrition, including children. These conditions were prevalent during the transatlantic crossing, when Africans were transported in overcrowded and unsanitary vessels with minimal food and water. Malnutrition, disease, and mistreatment resulted in the deaths of many before reaching the Americas. It's estimated that between 12 and 15 million people were forced to undertake this journey over more than 3 centuries, with roughly 2 million perishing during the passage. A man from the county is seen being carried by 2 slaves through the streets of Bahia, Brazil, in 1865. This scene exemplifies the slave system that still prevailed in Brazil, the last country in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. At the time, it was customary for upper-class men to utilize slave labor for mundane tasks, such as transportation in sedan chairs. Despite mounting international pressure for abolition, slavery remained the cornerstone of the economy in many regions of the country. A reward poster offers $150 for the capture of a runaway slave in Bardstown, Kentucky, in 1838. These notices were common in the 19th century, when slaveholders offered rewards for the recapture of those who had fled in pursuit of freedom. These advertisements typically included detailed descriptions of the runaway slave, noting physical characteristics and skills to aid in their apprehension. The $150 reward was substantial for the time, illustrating the perceived value of these enslaved individuals. This 1898 photograph, taken in Indiana, features Lucy Higgs Nichols at the center, a former slave who became the only female member of the Grand Army of the Republic, a Civil War veterans organization. Born into slavery in the South, Lucy escaped to Union lines during the war and worked as a nurse for the 23rd Indiana Infantry Regiment. Years after the conflict, Lucy was recognized as an honorary member of the organization, a remarkable accomplishment for a woman and former slave during an era of profound racial segregation and discrimination. Samuel Phillips Werner is pictured with Africans he brought to be exhibited at the St. Louis World's Fair in 1904. Werner transported these individuals to the United States, claiming they were pygmies in an attempt to exploit public fascination with African peoples, especially communities with distinct physical characteristics. The World's Fair was an international exhibition and, regrettably, often showcased racist displays that treated Africans as exotic curiosities. An Arab slave trader is in custody aboard the HMS Sphinx around 1907. The incident took place off the coast of Mozambique, where the Royal Navy patrolled the waters to combat the slave trade. After the formal abolition of slavery in the British Empire in 1833, operations like this led to the capture of traffickers and the liberation of enslaved people, representing the continuous struggle to dismantle the illicit slave trade in the region. This photograph was taken in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in April 1863, and is one of the most impactful images of its time. In it, we see Gordon, a slave who escaped a plantation, displaying his back covered in deep scars, the consequence of years of whipping. The image became known as the scourged back and was extensively used by abolitionists to combat slavery, even appearing in Harper's Weekly, further bolstering the fight for freedom during the Civil War. Here we see Rebecca Felton, one day before assuming office as the first female senator of the United States, alongside two politicians from Georgia, on November 20th, 1922. In addition to being the last former slaveholder to serve in the Senate, Felton championed white supremacy and, in public addresses, advocated for the use of violence to maintain racial control in the South. Felton also maintained that slavery was an institution that benefited both whites and blacks, a prevalent viewpoint among defenders of the system. The man in this photo was cruelly branded by his owner, who carved his initial into the man's forehead as a symbol of ownership. He wears a collar intended to inflict pain and prevent him from lying down or resting comfortably. Around him, we see other instruments employed to punish and degrade enslaved people. These objects were part of the daily reality for many slaves who were forced to labor under appalling conditions and endure inhumane treatment. The 4th United States Colored Infantry was one of the numerous units formed after the Emancipation Proclamation, issued by Abraham Lincoln on January 1, 1863. As the Civil War protracted, Lincoln deemed the emancipation of slaves crucial to weakening the Confederate States. The proclamation liberated all slaves in Confederate states and authorized freedmen to serve in the Union Army. Approximately 180,000 African American soldiers served in the Union Army, contributing to victory over the Confederacy. African American teenagers are detained in the convict labor system in Florida. After the end of slavery, many African Americans were arrested for crimes like vagrancy, a nebulous term that enabled the criminalization of virtually any behavior. Once incarcerated, they were forced to work without pay for the state or for private companies. This system, known as convict leasing, arose as another means to secure a continuous supply of unpaid labor and maintain control over the black population. This April 1939 photograph, taken in Marshall, Texas, shows Win Willis, a former slave, holding the horn used to summon slaves for daily work. At the time of the photo, Willis claimed to be 116 years old, born on March 10, 1822, as told to him by his former owner, Bob Wynn, when he was still young. Born in Louisiana, he lived to witness the United States transition from slavery to freedom and shared narratives about his past. A representation of the slave Anastasia wearing an iron mask, one of the numerous instruments of torture used during the slavery period in Brazil. These masks prevented the wearer from speaking, eating properly, or even breathing easily, and were primarily employed to silence those who attempted to rebel or disobey their masters. Anastasia's story made her a symbol of the struggle for freedom, demonstrating the brutal conditions many enslaved people faced in Brazil. Enslaved Africans are picking cotton under the supervision of an overseer. This scene was common on plantations in the southern United States, where enslaved labor was the foundation of the agricultural economy. Cotton, known as white gold, was one of the most profitable commodities of the time, and enslaved people toiled for extended hours in inhumane conditions to ensure abundant yields. Overseers, often armed, kept the slaves working at a rapid pace, employing harsh punishments for any sign of resistance or weariness. In this 1897 photograph, we see coyly sorting tobacco leaves under the supervision of a Dutch overseer in a warehouse in Delhi, Indonesia. In the late 19th century, tobacco production in Sumatra was one of the primary economic activities of the colony, supplying international markets. These laborers, often from China and India, were employed under precarious conditions, enduring long hours and meager wages. The use of coolie labor was widespread in Dutch colonies and was essential to the growth of the tobacco industry at the time.